Hello and welcome to the Wormhole Podcast. I'm Charlie Place, and with me today is the author of the historical novels Queen's Gambit, Sisters of Treason, Watch the Lady, The Girl in the Glass Tower, and The Poison Bed. Welcome E C Fremantle, otherwise known as Elizabeth.
Hello.
So, just to let you all know, today we're going to be focusing on The Poison Bed because 5 books would be quite a lot to cover in the time that we've got. But Liz and me did do an event in Southampton a few years ago where we covered her first 4 books, and that conversation is available on YouTube. I will put the link in the episode description for you. It's not great quality. It was a case of better than not having it recorded, but it is watchable. So, on with the show. And Liz, you've changed your pen name.
I have, yes. Well, Elizabeth was, I don't know, this seemed a very appropriate name. I've always been known as Liz, and it was actually my American editor who said that she wanted me to be Elizabeth because she felt it was an ideal name for a historical fiction writer. However, when I was writing The Poison Bed, though it's very much in a similar tone to my previous novels, it's thematically very similar. It is, however, it's cast in a different light. It's much, much more of a thriller, a straight thriller. It's about a murder. It's structured as a thriller. It's more pacey. And my UK publishers wanted to differentiate it from my other books. So it was their idea. And I was very happy to go along with it because I agree. It's a slightly different book. I don't know if you agree because you've read them all. So I don't know if you agree that there's a kind of distinctive atmosphere to The Poison Bed, which is different from the previous 4.
It is definitely a lot darker, yes.
Yeah.
But no, there is something about it that, yes, the atmosphere, I suppose, is a good way of putting it. It's definitely your book, but there is a difference there, yes.
So, and I don't know if it has confused people or not. It kind of appealed to me to have a gender neutral name, but it wasn't my decision, but I was happy with it.
So are you going to be E C Fremantle for a while, do you think?
That's a really good question. It hasn't been discussed further with my publishers, but really those kind of decisions are down to them. I don't feel super strongly about it. If they felt that didn't really, that wasn't something that really worked for, it's all about marketing, really, the name on the cover. And if they felt that it worked well for marketing, then we'll stick with it, I suppose.
So you're going to keep, do you think, with these more crime-related, darker books?
I mean, certainly my next book, which is called The Honey and the Sting, is a kind of companion piece to The Poison Bed, or certainly that's how I've written it. I mean, it's different again. It's not, The Poison Bed's very much a psychological thriller. And it's more of a suspense novel, with a strong theme of revenge in it. So I'm still back in that kind of dark Jacobean drama kind of world. But yes, it is. There's a relationship to The Poison Bed. Yeah.
I kind of want to ask what the relationship is because I'm thinking she's not going to keep us in France's head again, is she?
No,
that was quite a place to be.
We're not leaving Francis. We've got a completely different setting. Actually, it's completely away from the court, which I wanted to do a novel that wasn't about that, but where my protagonists were not kind of privileged courtiers, and so I've set it around three completely fictional women. They're all outsiders in their own way, each one of them. One is a woman who has visions. She can see the future, and in fact she would nowadays be called schizophrenic, but she's a woman who hears voices and sees visions. And there's a woman there's a half sister who is part mixed race, and there's the eldest sister who has a son, and the son is the son of the Duke of Buckingham, who was George Villiers in the Poison Bed. And he is trying to take his son back. And so it's their story about how they have to go into hiding to get to prevent him from kidnapping his son. And so the relationship there is, we still have the workings of this idea of the royal favourite. And so James's favourite, another of James's lovers, and actually George Villiers was really the one who became the most powerful of all of James I's favourites and became far too powerful for his own good. So, I'm talking about influence and power, misplaced power, women's position in society. And, so they are themes that I always return to, but they're in this slightly different setting, which is away from the court.
That sounds very, very fascinating. That's going to be a good book, I think. So shall we start with the Poison Bed? You've got the prologue there. Shall we have a reading?
So the novel, there are two protagonists to the novel. There's a female, Frances, and a male, Robert, who are a couple. They're married, and they are both each telling the story of how they came to be in the Tower of London, accused of murder. So I'm going to start at the beginning, and this is Frances. Just to give a little taste of, set the scene really. She was ready when they came, the three men. They smelt of damp wool and resisted staring, but stole furtive glances instead. She walked to the door. Her sister sobbed, folding her into a wet embrace, while the nurse, bawling child in her arms, watched with a blunt glare. Outside, the wind slapped hard in bitter gusts of mizzle. She felt eyes at the windows on her, but refused to adopt a posture of shame. Shame is ravenous. If it is allowed in, it will eat away at you to the bone. They followed the route towards the river, over slick cobbles. Must we go by water? She asked, but they had orders to obey. She became aware of a clamour, a frenzy of chanting and bellowing, and once through the gates, she saw the crowd, red faces, bared teeth. Were it not for her armed escort, she might have been torn limb from limb. The thought tightened her gut like a drawstring, and she forced her mind off it for fear of losing her composure. But neither could she think of the river's beckoning fingers, and wondered which was worse, the crowd, a quick, savage battering, or those icy fingers about her throat. A shadow broke from the throng, snarling, it spat. She lost her footing, skidded down the river steps, but was caught by one of the men and as good as carried the rest of the way down into the waiting boat. Hope you fall in and drown, bitch, someone shouted. She took her handkerchief from her cuff to wipe away the trail of mucus, discarding it over the side. It floated away, bobbing like a small white bird. The vessel jolted, and her head cracked hard against a wooden strut. The pain was sharp, but she maintained her poise. She would not give her escort the satisfaction of seeing her suffer. So we've got sound effects there. The boat slid into the tunnel that ran beneath the outer ramparts, where torches reflecting onto the rippled surface made it seem in flames. She half expected to encounter Cerberus when they reached the other side, but they found instead a small man, starched with deference, who took her hand to help her from the barge. She imagined his, beneath its glove, as a pink paw with sharp claws to go with his rodent's face. He led the way up a flight of steps. Wind whipped round the walls, tugging at her clothing as she waited for him to unlock a heavy door, which fell open with a shriek. Within, the chamber had small windows on both sides and an unlit hearth from which a foul stench emanated, as if a pigeon had died in the flue. One wall glistened with damp, and the chill made her shiver despite her thick cloak. The Attorney General will be here shortly, he said, without looking at her, and Bacon arrived as if on cue, blowing in through the door like a demon on a blast of wind. Why is the fire not lit? He said, even before making his greeting. I can't be expected to carry out my business in this cold. He paused to cast a look her way that pricked the nape of her neck. Can I? A boy was sent for. He set down his bucket of hot coals on the flagstones with a clang and began laying the hearth, while Bacon silently dissected her. His eyes hadn't an ounce of kindness in them. She had no use for kindness anyway. But she was accustomed to men responding to her appearance. In Bacon, she couldn't even discern so much as a dilated pupil, and that disarmed her. Perhaps she was not quite as immune to fear as she liked to believe. I haven't seen you since you hosted the celebration for my wedding. She wanted to remind him who she was. 3 years ago, he stated, seeming to imply that things had changed since then, and she regretted bringing it up. Her wedding and the circumstances that had brought her to this place were inextricably linked. His expression remained indecipherable. With a pair of tongs, the boy plucked a red-hot coal from his bucket, which caught the kindling instantly, flaring up. They became aware of heavy footfall mounting the steps and turned simultaneously towards the door. Her breath faltered. This must be the Lord Chief Justice now. He will be joining us. Cook lumbered in, wheezing. He smelt strongly of sweat, as if the steps had been a mountain, and ran his gaze slowly over her. She saw the hungry spark in Cook's eye, lacking in Bacon's. A young man, ledger tucked beneath his arm, slid quietly in behind him. She took back control and offered them a seat, as if it was a social visit, noticing that Bacon wiped the bench before he sat, slapping his palms together to remove the dust. The fire was smoking, stinging her eyes. The servant opened a window to help it draw, and Bacon snapped, "What do you think you're doing, idiot? In this weather?" The boy flinched as if he feared a beating, and she suggested he look in the chimney for blockages. He prodded about with a long broom, and the half-rotted carcass of a bird dropped into the flames. They watched it burn. The smell churned her stomach. "So," said Bacon, once the boy had gone, clasping his hands together and stretching them out, palms turned forward until his knuckles cracked. "I suppose you intend to deny the charges?" "No." She met his gaze. "I'm guilty." His posture crumpled almost imperceptibly. It was clear she had surprised him, even disappointed him, perhaps. "I wanted him dead."
I'm listening to that and I'm thinking, my goodness, now I've finished that book and got to, I don't want to spoil it, but there is a change somewhere in that book that surprises you potentially. And having got past that and got to the end and now hearing this prologue again, it just kind of shows the value of, I suppose, rereading and just how much has gone into these characters. On that note, the book has been called a historical gargoyle, which is an accurate description. The Poison Bed's an absolutely awful book. It's an awful, horrible book, and I'd give it top marks. So, Liz, can you tell us about the history of this story and what made you want to write about it?
Yes, I certainly can. And I find it funny you calling it an awful book, because it really is about the most mendacious, vile and horrible people. But somehow they are compelling.
Oh, definitely.
The story behind them is really a compelling story. It's a true story of a true murder that took place in the Tower of London in 1613. A courtier called Thomas Overbury was found dead in his cell, and this whole web of lies and cover-up kind of unfolded around this murder. And Frances, who we've just heard from, she was the daughter of a very, very influential family, the Howards. I mean, they were really one of the most powerful families in England at the time. And she had been extracted from a marriage to somebody else, the Earl of Essex, the son of the kind of more famous Earl of Essex, who launched a coup against Elizabeth I. And in a kind of scandalous divorce or annulment case, actually, because they had to have her marriage annulled because they wanted to marry her to Robert Carr, who was basically James I's lover and favourite. And the whole thing was so completely scandalous, including the murder. And it just made for this incredibly tense thriller. There was no way I could have written this as a straight history book, because it was just it's such a dark story, and it's so much about lies, and I think that was what I wanted to bring out about the story. It was sort of trying to it's a novel that tries to untangle a series of lies. And by the end, we kind of understand what my take on what really went on, although we don't really know what went on. And I can't reveal too much because I don't want to spoil it.
So I know you said the writing of the book was difficult. You say in the acknowledgements, it arrived kicking and screaming. Obviously, it's a difficult book to read. And you said, the story is quite nasty, really. Was it difficult writing it?
Well, one, spending so much time with such manipulative people as my characters was a challenge. Because they're really dark. I mean, the Howard family, particularly Francis's great uncle, is a really dark character. And then we've got this playoff between the two protagonists who are, it's hard to work out if they're victims or not of their situation. And in some ways they are, and in some ways they aren't. But I think what was most difficult about it was the kind of technical aspects of writing the book. So the structure of it, structuring it. I mean, in as much as it's a thriller, you have to slowly drip feed the facts to the reader. And there is a kind of a disparity between what the reader knows and what the characters know, and what secrets there are between the characters that the reader does or doesn't know about. And so all those technical aspects were really, really challenging, because they can take over and then you lose atmosphere. And my writing is particularly about the atmosphere and the characters. And so I didn't want that to be sacrificed for the plot. That was the most tricky thing about it.
You say about structure, that was something I noticed. I know at the start I was thinking, I'm not sure who these people are. I'm going to get into it. And I had the wrong people in my head because I just read another book on the Essexes and it was different people. So that probably made it worse for me. But I noticed that Francis feels closer to you as the reader. Robert's more distant, I suppose. Was that part of your planning?
Yes. I mean, really, it is Francis's story primarily. But I think his story is really important. But I think because she's really at the heart of the story, and so he's sort of supporting actor to her lead role in a way. But, his voice is a large part of the book. But I think also so much of his voice is about his obsession with her, whereas her voice is less about him and more about all the other elements of the story. His voice is nearly all about her. She is, so it really makes her so central and makes us understand her from all these different perspectives.
Saying that, yes, that's very interesting. So, I mean, lots of people are going to know a bit about the Howard family due to Catherine Howard. She's possibly the most famous person. Who was Robert Carr?
So Robert Carr was a kind of son of a very minor gentry, Scottish, but he wasn't raised in Scotland. I think for a lot of his youth, he was raised in the West Country. I'm trying to remember. I get confused with my characters when I move on to another book. And then I think both his parents died and he was sort of taken under the wing of another courtier close to James the First James the Sixth of Scotland, so in Scotland at that point. Mm-hmm. And he met this chap, Thomas Overbury, who's the murder victim in the book. And they were very close associates, and Overbury kind of took him under his wing a little bit. And he was introduced into the court and almost immediately caught the eye of James the First, because he was a very pretty boy, Robert Carr, and he fell off his horse at a jousting, festival, and very close to where the king was sitting, and came to the king's notice, and the king, he broke his leg, and the king kind of made a huge fuss about it and visited him every day. And from then on, he was made a gentleman of the bedchamber, and then, the usual trajectory for men, certainly for James's favourites. I mean, I say, and I characterise him as the king's lover. A historian would say, we don't know that he was the king's lover. For me, there is sufficient evidence to make it really plausible to say, and that's what fiction can do. They certainly had a very, very passionate friendship and intimate friendship, whether they actually had a physical relationship or not. I mean, James I was known to kiss his favourites on the mouth, kind of proper French kissing in public. He wasn't coy about his proclivity for men. So Robert Carr he had a string of favourites, and Robert Carr was one of the main ones. And of course, this caused a lot of jealousy because he was a man from nowhere. He wasn't from a noble family. But of course, the Howards, very powerful. They saw how powerful Robert Carr was becoming as a result of being the king's favourite, and they wanted to align their family with him. So hence the marriage between him and Francis.
Do you think there was, at least at the start, I suppose you could say, love between Robert and Francis?
Well, I think yes. I think probably yes. There's certainly, are you talking about in my novel or in historically speaking?
I suppose historically speaking, I mean, yes, it's more likely that they were pawns, but do you think there might have been something there, or was that a fiction, I suppose?
It's very, very hard to get to the truth. I mean, she's been depicted as a manipulative little hussy. But I think there was extreme attraction there. And they were very much the it couple of the court. They were both known for their looks. And actually, there are only one or two portraits of Robert Carr, and one of them he looks really, really strange. But you read descriptions of him, and, he was kind of very, very blonde curly hair. I imagine the two of them as being, almost in a kind of what Freud would have labeled a narcissistic object choice relationships. I wanted them to almost look like each other. So she looks in some ways quite androgynous, and so does he. And so they look at each other and see themselves, and they're all both slightly in love with themselves as well. So that was what I tried to do with it. But I think, yes, there was certainly a powerful attraction. And I don't think they could have effectively made the marriage. They couldn't have arranged the marriage for Robert Carr, who was, also he was a bisexual man, clearly. He really, really wanted to be married to Francis. And that was, I believe, because he really, really fell for her. And the difficulties in getting this marriage through were so great. He had to have really been in love with her and besotted with her. Whether she was as besotted with him, I don't know. And you see in the book, he's more besotted than she is. So, yeah, it's hard to know the real truth, though.
I'm just going to say, for anyone listening to this podcast, I'm going to include a picture of Frances Howard in the show notes because it's a very interesting picture of her. I can't remember who it's drawn by. I will put that in there as well. But it's
the Larkin one.
The Larkin, yes, yeah, the one on your blog, I think it was.
Yeah.
But I found that fascinating. The dress she's wearing and how much you can see, let's say.
It's very loose, isn't it? Although I have to qualify that by, the way we look at it now and we think, oh, goodness, that's a bit racy. But in fact, actually, many, many noble women were painted in dresses that low cut. It was the fashion of the time. And in fact, there's a really amazing account from earlier, a couple of decades earlier of I can't remember, maybe it's a Spanish ambassador coming into an audience with the quite elderly Queen Elizabeth and commenting that he could actually see her breasts because her dress was cut so low. So, it's easy for us to look at that and think, oh, that you're really, we can tell what kind of woman you are by that dress. But it actually, in context, it's a little bit less shocking than it is for us.
Yeah, we do have an idea of everything, but maybe we think a bit too much about how people were purer, I suppose. But yeah, no, that is an interesting thing to hear. So talking more on Frances, and a completely different subject, but she has a baby and you don't actually know whether it definitely is hers at the start or not, which I thought was really interesting because it could have been Nellie's. But Frances always calls it. Do you think your version of Frances may have come to like her baby?
Well, I think that was very deliberate on my part. And the daughter, she grew up to be a seemingly well-adjusted young woman. But I think Frances, the situation she was in when her child was, because her child was born during the time when she was under house arrest. And her child was tiny, or still, when she was taken to the Tower. So, we're looking at a woman in a postpartum situation, extremely fragile time for a woman. And she, I think, in my mind, it was plausible to imagine she wouldn't want to bond with the child because she didn't know what the outcome of this trial would be, whether she would be executed. And the idea of, bonding with the child would be too painful. So in a sense, the idea, the way she refers to the child as either the child or it, or, there's this distance there, was a kind of, for me, a way of protecting herself, because she thought either the child would be taken off her or she would be executed. And so I think that was tied up in her relationship to it. And, it's plausible, too, that she may well have had a certain amount of postnatal depression or kind of slight mania, and she has terrible, terrible dreams. And after all, she's being locked in the Tower of London. It's not surprising. Yeah.
I'm going to talk about the ending a bit. So listeners, if you haven't yet read the book, skip to 32 minutes and 24 seconds. Were you ever tempted to change the history as it was for your book?
No, actually. With this book, that never really came up, because the thing is, historically, we don't really know what happened. There are court transcripts. We've got all of that, but we do not know what kind of plea bargains were struck, what cover-ups there were. It definitely, a lot of it looks dodgy. You read it and you think, there are things that are not completely clear. And a court case in those days, which, it comes to a kind of a court case at the end. That it's not like a court case now where you really, really hope to get to the bottom of something, though that does not always happen, as we know. In those days, it was really just not really a means of getting to the truth, but a means of getting a judgment. And usually the judgment somebody in power wanted. There were certainly reasons that the king didn't want Robert Carr on the witness stand giving away some of his own secrets. And so we've got all sorts of reasons why people might have been not been telling the truth, even in the trial. So that freed me up to give it whatever kind of ending I wanted.
There was a very bad ending, both in your fiction and factually, for Anne Turner, who was Frances. Well, it's hard to say really who she was because Frances is so secretive. But can you tell us the story of Anne Turner? Because I did look briefly and it sounds very, very sad.
She's a really interesting character, Anne Turner. And, history's not been kind to her, because she became deeply embroiled with the whole scandal, the marriage, the murder. She was a very close associate of Frances. But she was a kind of interesting woman. She was, I think, her husband, she was a widow, but she was very impoverished, and she'd fallen for some chap who wouldn't marry her. And then at court, there was this great fashion for gold ruffs. And of course, the rich courtiers had ruffs that were made of real gold. They were gold thread. But of course, that was extremely expensive. But Anne Turner got this patent for a special starch, a special method of starching with saffron that made ruffs that were simply cotton look like these gold ruffs. And they became a huge hit at court. And Frances and her had a kind of business, and it was Anne Turner's business. And so I kind of touch on that a bit in the book. And because I think it's a really interesting idea that this woman, she was a sort of a businesswoman, but she was also, people thought she was a madam, and she did arrange for the couple in love to meet under her roof. And so she's basically running a kind of brothel. And so it's all, a kind of juicy little slice of underworld with Anne Turner. But of course, she gets so deeply involved with this case and is guilty of, basically, she gets involved with this chap Overbury is poisoned, and she is found guilty of handling the poisons and not administering them, but having them sent into the tower where they were given to him to eat in various jellies or jams that, so, and she was hung, as were a couple of others around the case. Yes, they didn't come off too well. But Anne Turner, it's an interesting story. And, she could have merited a novel of her own, actually.
Now, I was horrified when I was reading that these people, I did briefly look at the Wikipedia page before I'd quite finished the book, because I was just like, I'd like to get some, not photographs, what am I saying? Paintings of them in my head, these people, and I happened to see the list of the people that were killed. I was like, goodness, the two people who may well have done the deed escaped, and there was just this, okay, it's not a particularly long list, I suppose, but in context, it's a long list of people who died, and it was horrific. Yeah.
Yes, they were really all the pawns of more powerful people. And I think the one that really got off scot-free, because he died earlier, and his death is something I did invent, in terms of, though I'm not going to talk about it in great detail because it's a shame to give it away, but the manner of his death is something that I invented for the purposes of the novel. Is her great uncle, Frances's great uncle, who died before the whole murder case came to light. And I mean, there's no question that he was deeply embroiled in it. Certainly one of the perpetrators. Yeah.
Spoilers end here. Shall we have the second reading, which is from Robert's point of view?
Certainly. So yes, just a short little reading, but it gives us a taste of, well, certainly his voice and his primary obsession, which was Frances. So this is also from early in the novel. It's actually our first introduction to Robert. I sit alone in the gloom. A shaft of thin light leaks through a single window. The other is covered. I cannot bear the view it offers. I line up the few relics I have of her, among them a small pearl, a square of unwashed linen, and a package of letters tied with a ribbon that once held her undergarments together. I hold it to my nose, but her smell is gone, leaving me with the memory of untying it, her clothes falling away to expose the landscape of her flesh. Heat surges through my body. Tears burn the back of my eyes. I must find a way to make sense of my situation, find believable answers to all the questions I am asked over and over again. But fear coils itself around my throat until I think I will choke. So I think of her. And then it goes on to recount where he first met her, where it's a kind of love at first sight. And he's more the romantic, certainly, in this story. She has to be more of a pragmatist because she's kind of, she has to deal with more challenging situations as a young woman.
No, I know I switched who I was hoping would be okay. No, I can't say that without spoilers. I will leave that bit.
It's one of them.
So to go back to the uncle at Northampton, he is the man who seems to be running the show, the patriarch of the family. Who was he, and did he work alone in that sense?
Well, I think, he was the head of the Howard family. So he was the uncle of Frances's father, who was, also a very powerful nobleman. And they all feature in the book. Her mother and father are rather unpleasant as well. And she had, I think she was one of 9 children. There were loads of brothers and they were all important. But Northampton, I mean, he is a really ruthless power monger. And I think what we have to sort of set the context of the Howards at that time. They had crawled their way back from obscurity because, of course, they fell out of favour in the Elizabethan period when I think there were two Howards. Elizabeth executed one who was the elder brother of Northampton. I'm trying to get my history straight. I think it was his elder brother who was executed, and then all the lands and the titles were taken away. So they had to crawl back from this. And of course, James I coming to the throne was an opportunity for them to really, really re-establish themselves. I think they'd sort of vaguely re-established themselves, but this was a kind of complete change of monarch. And they got back in there, and they were, so he, I mean, in my mind, he controlled the whole thing like a mafia don. And actually, I looked at mafia stories. I reread The Godfather and books like that as a way to get a sense of that ruthless, clannish power. Mm. You know, that idea of the family that they want to hold on to their power at any cost. And there is no respect for life and no respect for anything except a kind of interior code by which they work. And, you know, that for me was very much like the mafia. So that's how I saw the Howards. And he was the head of the Howards. So he was never going to be a particularly sympathetic character.
So you said about The Godfather, which is fascinating to hear, you watching that as well in this context. Were there any other stories, films, media, anything that inspired this book?
Actually, yes. There was one book, and it's called The Book of Evidence, and it's a John Banville book. And if you read it, you think there's nothing like it. But there's something about it's about a man who, and it's a very literary novel, but it's about a man who commits a crime sort of through force of circumstance. He kills somebody, but it's almost banal the way he does it. And there's this tone in it. It's a kind of confessional tone. And a lot of this, The Poison Bed, is confession. It's the two protagonists making their confession to the reader in some ways. So that was a book that it didn't really influence it in terms of getting the tone of the novel, of the voices, and that sense of this murder having been convenient. That came from that book, or that book really kind of helped me understand that. And I often read around from very unexpected other sources when I don't only read history books, and I'll read other novels. And for the Poison Bed, I read a lot of contemporary psychological crime to get a sense of the pace, and because I wanted it to be a little bit more pared down than the usual historical fiction, because I wanted the psychological story to take precedence over the kind of historical setting. So yes, I read lots of, I'm trying to think of examples of contemporary crime, you know, I mean, all the kind of big psychological thrillers I read extenssemany. I do read an awful lot. I think that's how I can be a writer, because that's how you keep reminding yourself how books work, is by reading them.
Well, had you read Gone Girl?
I had not read Gone Girl. I had seen the film of Gone Girl, and I certainly, when I knew about the structure of Gone Girl, and then of course when I started writing this, there are things from the structure of Gone Girl that are quite similar in that it's two people telling the story one after the other, alternately, and neither one really has the full picture of the other one's story, and they're telling the same story. And so I knew that there were similarities to the way Gone Girl was structured. And then I thought, I should probably read Gone Girl. And then I thought, no, actually, I shouldn't read Gone Girl because I don't want to be over influenced by that. So I didn't read it until afterwards.
It's interesting because it is a perfect description, I think, to say it is a historical Gone Girl. And I kind of had that in my mind when I was reading. I was like, I want to see why, why it was called the historical Gone Girl. And particularly as it gets towards the end, or it carries on, it's like, yeah, it's absolutely perfect. So I had wondered, if that had been something you had said, oh, my book is like Gone Girl. So I have one more question about this book, if that's okay. Frances reads palms and uses pendulums, and she states during the book herself that it isn't considered witchcraft. And obviously at this time in history, witchcraft was big and women were being put in the river for nothing really.
Yeah.
Where did the line fall between this idea of witchcraft and it not being witchcraft?
Well, I think also, I mean, the thing about Frances was she was in a privileged position. She could pretty much do anything she wanted, and her kind of palm reading and pendulums, all that was a kind of party trick and taken as that. And those kind of things went on at court. Whereas out in the wider world, and if a woman really transgressed badly and was then deemed a witch or deemed to be involved in witchcraft, it was the casting of spells that was the taboo. So had she been, and I think, there's a preoccupation with, whether she would be accused of casting spells, because that's the thing. And there is an incident, which I don't want to talk about too much either, because I don't want to spoil it for people, but where she goes to a woman who she basically makes a living out of casting spells for people. And she's sort of inveigled into visiting this woman. And she's terrified because the woman offers to cast a spell for her. And she's desperate, saying, no, you can't do this. I don't want a spell cast for me. So that was the line. And that was the line that was drawn back then as well. The casting of spells was witchcraft and anything else wasn't really. And we have the man, I can't remember his name now, Dr. Terrible. He's the one where they go to, he's the apothecary type man, and they go, and he's involved in all the dark arts, but he is sort of set up as a kind of doctor where people go to have their astrological charts read and, to make decisions about their future and their health. There were all sorts of practitioners like that in those days, and they weren't thought of as witches or performing witchcraft, but it was a fine line. And it's a fine line that she's afraid of traversing on many an occasion in the novel.
No, it surprised me because I thought there was a lot less tolerance, I suppose, for anything of that, if you even stepped towards it. So that was something that really surprised me. Yes. So when I contacted you about coming on this podcast, you were finishing your latest novel and you've already introduced it. Is there anything else you can tell us about it? When can we look forward to seeing it?
Okay, well, I don't have a definite date for it, but it will be this year, and it's most likely to be in August. And that was from a conversation with my editor only a couple of days ago. That's the latest date for it at the moment. Those things can change, but I think it's very likely it will be in the summer and not later than that, because then you get into all the big run up to Christmas, the big biographies and things. And so summer's a good time for fiction. So August is where they're looking at the moment. Yes, and it's called The Honey and the Sting, which is a Francis Bacon quote, and a very good one, I think.
Does it refer to anything in particular?
Well, it is, yes. Francis Bacon uses it when he's giving advice to George Villiers about how to deal with, advice about how to be a good statesman, really, is you have to use, on the one hand, you have to be sweet to people, and on the other hand, you have to be ruthless. And actually, I've applied this to my central female character, who's called Hester, and who discovers that she can't just be nice. She has to, in some ways, be ruthless if she's going to save her son from being kidnapped by his really thoroughly unpleasant father. And yes, so that's her trajectory, really, is moving from the person who sees herself as always and only ever good, kind of compromising her own morality in order to achieve what she needs to achieve. It all sounds a little bit abstract, but it's hard to talk about because I've just finished it.
Abstract's good for now. It will make us excited about what's to come. So Queen's Gambit, your first book, there is going to be an adaptation for it, I believe. Can you tell us more?
Yes, I can't tell you very much more, but it is still in the pipeline. And there's now a screenplay that everybody's happy with, that I have read, that I really liked it, though it's very different. So I think some purist fans of Queen's Gambit might kind of feel it's a bit of a departure. But I think the Catherine in that, it's my Catherine. So I'm really pleased with that. But they focused very much on the political thriller aspects of the story, which I really like. So it's a very tense and tight, dramatic script. So I'm excited about that. I don't know when they will really kind of get the proper go-ahead to start filming. And I think they're working on who's to be cast at the moment. So that's a kind of watch this space, really.
Something to put down as a note to check later, listeners. That and the newest book, which may be August, but keep an eye on it. So I think one of them introduced themselves to us earlier. How long have you had your poodles?
Well, Tommy, who was the noisy one, who just barked, he is 9, and I've got Lola, who's 12. So they're not young dogs, but they behave like naughty toddlers most of the time.
So The Poison Bed is out in paperback. Links to buy copies of it, as well as Liz's previous books, are in the episode description. If you have enjoyed our conversation, do subscribe to the podcast for future episodes. We will likely have Liz back when she has her next book out. Liz, it's been awesome talking to you again and having you here, and I'm excited to read your next book. I am. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure, Charlie, and I'd love to come back and talk about anything else if there's anything exciting going on.
Join me on Monday the 10th of February when I will be talking to Andrew Blackman, author of On the Holloway Road and A Virtual Love. The Wormhole Podcast Episode 7 was recorded on the 16th of January and published on the 27th of January 2020. Music and production by Charlie Place.